Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, the Carolinas have been on a bit of a tear lately. New job announcements have been liberal and widespread. Most recent was a North Carolina record, 2,600 MetLife jobs spread between Cary and Charlotte. But other new positions include Time Warner bringing over 600 to Columbia, another 500 jobs at a Michelin expansion in the upstate of South Carolina, 400 new jobs with a company called MSC Industrial in Davidson, North Carolina. And the list continues and rolls on, is long. And that is a good problem to have. Welcome again to this weekly and the most widely watched dialogue about Carolina business and public policy. In a recent report prepared by the North Carolina General Assembly, the Tar Heel State spent $1.35 billion on economic development in 2011 and 2012. In South Carolina, from 2009 to 2010, Palmetto State economic development spending was more around the $833 million mark. Many argue that this kind of expenditure is counter to fiscal frugality, and others say it's just not enough. The issue is big business, and there is a lot at stake, both from the total resources we invest to the return of this investment. We will start the dialogue and meet our panel in just a moment.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded March 15th, 2013. On this week's program, Kit Cramer of the Asheville Chamber of Commerce, Louis Gossett of the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance, Dr. Frank Hefner of the College of Charleston, and Dr. David Swindell of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
Hello, welcome to our program. Welcome all. Good to have you back.
Thanks.
David, welcome to this gang. You might not be back after this little while.
Oh dear.
No, I'm kidding. Good to have you here, David. Frank, I want to start with you. You know, we're not going to talk about incentives yet, but I want to kind of back into it. We've seen the stock market hit record highs. Mm-hmm. We've seen housing in the Carolinas arguably showing a trend now, right, and a healthy trend. We've seen industrial production look good. We've seen unemployment declining. Is it fair to say that we're back?
Well, at least this time we're getting a trend with more than 1 point. I mean, traditionally what we've done, if we're not careful, is get one blip of improvement and everyone gets excited and say we're on a trend. We're actually now back-to-back series of successes. You listed a number of the announcements, and there's some problems that we can get into that also later about announcements versus actual delivery of jobs. But clearly there are a lot of positives in both the Carolinas and the nation that say that we're probably clearly in a good recovery. However, you know, as an economist, you always have to put the dark side on the other side of the table.
I'd be disappointed.
Thank you. And the thing I want to point out is, because when we were looking at the jobs numbers this morning, we haven't quite gotten back to 2006. So we still have a ways to go to get to that height. Now, maybe that was an unreasonable height at that point, but we're still shy of the 2006 employment level in South Carolina.
Shy meaning 5%, 10%?
I don't have it off the top of my head. But on the other hand, you got to remember that population has increased since then also. So we've got some good growing to go, but fortunately we are growing.
Okay, so the timing of some pretty stellar economic development announcements, and not just the one in Charlotte, about 2,600 jobs in Charlotte and Cary. But Louis, how is the timing of this working out? I mean, Michelin, Boeing, all of the Time Warner and Columbia. What's going on here? Is this the fruit of all of the things that have been working since 2008, or is there's something else here that it's not apparent?
Well, I think in South Carolina we have to start out with a very aggressive economic development recruiting effort that has paid some dividends in the last couple of years, and it's paid dividends in terms of announcements and the jobs. A lot of them haven't come online, but are in the pipeline and are certainly going to occur. South Carolina has a governor and a secretary of commerce that understand that you can't sit on the sidelines and be inactive in this day and age. You've got to be aggressive. You've got to be competing with other states and other countries. I was at a conference in Washington on Monday and Tuesday where we were discussing the automotive sector and about how it's not just Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama anymore, but we are really, really being pushed by the Mexicans, and about how a lot of the automotive sector is going there. And if we're going to keep it going, if we're going to sustain what's starting to occur right now, then we've got to continue to be aggressive in our marketing and recruiting efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kit, same thing. Is this a series of announcements? I mean, it's hitting on all 8 cylinders, it seems like.
Well, it inherently feels better to me. If you're not looking at numbers, I can tell you things are better. Our tourism is up. We've seen more houses moving. Some of them are at the lower end, but still, we'll take it. We've got a good pipeline for economic development as well. I think things are finally beginning to, knock on wood, improve.
Yeah. David, jump in here.
Well, the fact that we have a very low housing stock right now indicates that we're poised pretty closely for a real growth in housing, which is what's going to drive real growth. That's where we're going to pick up real GDP, real gross state product as well, that will employ a lot of those people to get those numbers back up, and that's going to be both in North and South Carolina, and nationally, quite frankly.
I want to come back to something you said, Lewis. You're talking about the auto industry and feeling the heat, the competitive heat from south of the border here. Jeff Immelt, Chairman and CEO of GE, was at the Charleston I think it was the Charleston Chamber
of Commerce.
Yeah, thank you. Were you there
Yes.
for that? And he was talking about this issue that that companies aren't chasing the cheapest labor anymore. Right. Now they're trying to locate in a place that's close to their market. The jobs really don't matter. Do you buy that?
Yes, I do. I think that the low labor costs and low land costs has been something of a myth in South Carolina for quite some time now. The average wage for manufacturing, with the data I looked at earlier this week in South Carolina, is $52,000 a year now, and it's certainly much higher than that in certain industrial sectors. Land is certainly not cheap. Frank and I were talking before the show about some of the land prices just north and west of the port, and how they've increased dramatically.
This is the port in Charleston?
Right, the port in Charleston. They've increased dramatically. And so it's not just a question of that. The big challenge is going to be, can you have an economic climate that is good for manufacturing? Can you be close in proximity to markets and to supply chains and that sort of thing? But also, can you produce the workforce that will man these facilities? And that's going to be our biggest challenge going forward, and it's going to be the deciding factor, in my opinion, as to whether or not states like North Carolina and South Carolina participate in this reshoring trend that is occurring. We can either be part of it or we can miss it, and that will largely be determined about whether or not we have a workforce that can do it.
So how do you go ahead?
Well, one thing, because you brought up Jeff, and another question to get back to this. Business is basically in business to do business, fundamentally. And what's one thing we've been hearing for years now? They've all been sitting on the sidelines. They've been all accumulating cash. They've got cash reserves, and they're
still sitting on a lot.
Yeah, but they're waiting. So the question is, I think a lot of them have now gotten to the point where the timing is important, and this might be a good time. The one thing that Mr. Immel brought up also on the labor front was, if I got the number right, to make a GE refrigerator is 2.5 hours of labor. It's not the biggest component of the production problem anymore, cost. So even if labor costs a little bit more, it's only 2.5 hours of it to produce that. It's the capital, it's the raw materials, it's the electricity, it's everything else that goes into it. And we are very competitive in that compared to a lot of other places in the world.
So wait a minute, let me understand something. So the labor cost is no longer their largest single issue cost when they manufacture
on that
refrigerator.
That's
on
right.
that
refrigerator, correct.
Okay. All right, Kit, I wanted you heard the question that Lewis asked. How do you answer that?
Well, now I don't remember what the question was.
It was about, I had asked him, heck, I don't remember what the question was. No, it was about the whole idea that you don't have to chase the lowest labor cost anymore.
I agree.
Yeah, so how do you spin that in Western North Carolina?
I do think we have to have a well-educated workforce. And one of the things we just heard within the last couple of weeks is that North Carolina's pay for teachers has dropped to almost the bottom. And during the Jim Hunt administration, it had gotten to the national average. So it makes me wonder what we're doing in terms of the preparation of kids. And we've long been known for an outstanding university system. That's something we've got to protect. And we know in Western North Carolina, the use of our community colleges and the training that they can provide is absolutely critical as an economic development tool for the people we recruit.
David, I know you're a practitioner in the academic system, that you both are, but Kit brings up a good point. It was actually one of the bullet points that I felt very compelled to make today, and that was this whole idea of the labor, the skills gap, if you will, that it's not so much the 4-year education any longer, but it really is tying closer. And we had Scott Rawls in this program, and we had the head of the South Carolina Technical College system out here as well, recently talking just about that they've seen such an explosion. So I guess the question is, how do, from an economic development standpoint, how do economic developers, how do all those around trying to build business development in the states impress upon legislators that this education investment really is critical and really does have a short-term return, too?
The challenge is that legislators are looking for a silver bullet. There is no such thing. It is it's a compound effect of multiple inputs that we're making investments in infrastructure, investments in our labor force. We're doing a host of activities that lead to economic development. So if we are concerned about having a trained labor force, we're going to need good K-12 education. We're going to need good community colleges, good technical schools, and good 4-year schools, and good graduate programs that are going to generate people who are going to come up with the new ideas, the entrepreneurial ideas for tomorrow, as well as the workers who are going to be able to work in the facilities today. So we've got to do it across the board, and that comes back to the issue about the incentives with regards to these are little tiny nuggets. That's not systemic change. Economic development is about structural change. Economic impact is about a specific individual incentive.
So how do you? And this is open to anybody here. When we talk about economic incentives and we see this 2,600 record job announcement in North Carolina for MetLife, and the cost, if you will, quote unquote, was over $90 million to the state of North Carolina. That seems like it's a very hard concept to put in a headline. Do you think? Anyone here, really, do you think that the complexity of economic development and incentives giving is lost in the communication between the deal and the public?
Yes, absolutely, because it is so complex. And the people I talk to have a tendency to believe that when incentives are provided, it's a cash outlay to the company. Right. There really is no concept that it's money that they're going to earn over time by producing the jobs they say they're going to produce or spending the capital that they're going to spend. People don't understand it. We actually did a primer at our place to try and help those who are running for office understand it, because they ultimately have to make the decision about whether to approve or disapprove incentive packages. And unfortunately, incentives are something we've got to have in order to compete.
You're uncharacteristically quiet on this.
Well, actually, I won't be. We have a very frustrating dynamic going on right now, and I'd actually disagree with a little bit of the intro, Chris, and that is you talk about the state spending money on economic development, and those numbers are very large. If you think about it, as I've understood it, and Frank can certainly correct me on this, part of that equation is what we don't collect in tax revenue, and I would argue tax revenue we never would have gotten in the first place. And it was best illustrated when I was testifying on sales tax exemptions for manufacturers. Essential to keeping manufacturing in South Carolina is preserving and protecting the sales tax exemptions that are on the books for various things that we do. And one of the members of the General Assembly, a fairly conservative Republican by his account, said to me, Lewis, you got to understand, if we're going to give the state's money to these companies, I want to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. And I stopped him and said, with all due respect, it's not your money. It's ours. The question is whether or not you're going to take it from us. And to be blunt, if you do take it from us, we'll go somewhere else.
You mean take the ability to make economic incentives?
No, if you take tax revenue from companies at an excessive rate, keep in mind, it is their money you're taking. It was made as a result of their efforts. It's not the government's money until it's confiscated. And at that point, you have to understand that those companies will make economic decisions. And if we charge sales taxes on power, and you've got a $30 million a year power bill, and that would be about average for good manufacturing companies of certain sizes, then sales taxes on that's going to hit you another $2.5 million. You're going to make some decisions once you get that bill. And usually the decision is you're going to manufacture somewhere else.
Right.
So again, that's a disincentive. You're talking about using the tax code there as a disincentive, as opposed to an incentive to try and lure people in or expand an existing business. I think that is another important piece of this, which goes to the complexity of the whole picture.
And David, that's exactly when people, in this dialogue we're having right now, this is exactly when people's eyes glaze over and they get lost.
Well, that's the problem because of the complexity. I'm going to pick on a well-known company that's been a success, which is BMW. And as a result of that, there's been some problems with analyzing it. So part of the issues of this, there was a debate about this. You can either take the 0% or the 100%. The 100% is we're giving everything away because they would have come anyway. That may not be true. The 0 is we're not giving anything away because if they weren't here, we wouldn't have been able to tax them. So which one do we go with that? The other part of it is we wouldn't have to have what are sometimes called incentives if we hadn't created the tax structure that is a disincentive.
Absolutely.
So, for example, if our property taxes are too high for this company, they're probably too high for all companies. The other last point I want to get while I'm on the floor here is that for some reason in the economic development game, they're a lot like people that manage athletes. You do the athletic contract, it's a $600 million contract over. Why do we pump these things up? How much of the incentives to BMW were really incentives to Greenville, the extension of the airport? Was that beneficial to everybody? How much of it was if you want to call it an incentive or a transfer, to the workers for their education? That was a benefit to them so they could get the jobs at BMW. When you look at the bottom line, in South Carolina at least, we'd write very few checks to businesses in terms of just handing them money.
We don't loan money or give it out. You look at the closing fund. The closing fund that South Carolina has, which is modest by comparison to other states, is generally used for specific infrastructure projects and things, as you mentioned. And when you take the highest industrial property taxes in the country, which is what we have, the 100%, 0%, which Frank is referring to, you can't make the argument that a large manufacturer would come here anyway, as long as we're sitting at 10.5, and right across the border in Georgia, I think they're at 0, and Nova Scotia offers 0, and North Carolina's are significantly less. They will not come here unless we do something about that, and that's a big part of the incentive package.
So let's go with this idea, Frank, and I like the idea that you had about this, the whole issue of disincentives, David, okay? So in North Carolina, and I look at our North Carolina panelists
We
here.
need tax reform.
Well, they're working on tax reform.
Yes, they are.
So how does that...
We're going to get it.
But how
It's
does
probably going to be painful, but we do need tax reform.
Okay, but well, let's project that out. Let's try to look around a corner here, Kit. How does that change the DNA of then the incentives game in North Carolina? Because it will.
Well, it will, and so we've got to look at the incentives and see what really applies. Once you've fixed the tax situation, which isn't going to be a short-term project. And you also need regulatory reform, and they're talking about working on that. We were just in Raleigh this week with 7 chambers from Western North Carolina, and both need to be addressed desperately. And we're going to then have to look at incentives that are currently available to see if they still apply in the same kind of way. But right now, taxes and regulations are some of our biggest disincentives, and we've really got to do something. You were comparing South Carolina with some other states. You look at Tennessee; they've got a great tax structure in many ways, and we're jealous. And
But they have some other limitations that help
right,
us.
and I guess everybody does to one degree
Exactly,
or another,
sure.
but we've got to address it. And
Well, that's why we're 50 laboratories. We have 50
Right.
experiments on how to do this correctly.
So consequently,
yeah.
to that point, are we looking at the wrong competitor? Isn't South Carolina really competing globally?
Of course we are.
Not with North Carolina?
No, exactly.
And in
Right.
fact, there's a regional component to this that is often overlooked by politicians. I understand why. If you are recruiting for a state, if you're the chief executive officer for a state and you're in heated competition for a big project and you don't get it and the other state does, politically you don't have a very good day the next day. But if it's a certain kind of manufacturing project, what you can expect is a supply chain. And what you can expect is spillover across the borders. And that was emphasized this past week in that automotive meeting, that we are working regionally more than we have before. Because getting these facilities located, there are BMW suppliers in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Tennessee. And that happens across the board. In automotive, it's Mexico. It's Mexico. That's who we're competing with right now, and that trend is growing. Last year, $3.7 billion invested in the United States in the automotive industry. $3.7 billion invested in Mexico.
You know, we've talked around it a little bit here, and I want to bring this up. And it is a hot issue, but it was a hot issue in Asheville, and it is in Charlotte now. And then we're talking about the airport authority, and it's not so much. And I am going to ask you about that, by the way. But the intergovernmental relations part of this dialogue has kind of boiled over into the public. And it happened 2 years ago in North Carolina when they lost the Continental Tire piece to South Carolina. And it was an ugly day in North Carolina, not one of their best moments, when the governor's office and the legislature were going back and forth at each other in public purview. My point is this, is intergovernmental relations is kind of key here, don't you think?
yes.
And so what can we do differently to make this work better?
Well, I'll leave it up to them because I don't do intergovernmental. I'm not too sure. In other words, if I could answer that question, how to make politics work better, that would be phenomenal.
Oh, okay,
But,
well, David,
that is really the key right now because we're seeing differences of opinion. And there's always going to be differences of opinion. But we've now seen difference of opinion in a lot of places, nationally also, where it's causing gridlock.
Right.
And it's causing problems in terms of unwillingness to compromise and unwillingness to give credit and unwillingness to share credit and work together. So to the extent that differences of opinion are good because it creates dialogue, of course, we've got to all be in favor of it. To the extent that it creates a gridlock and keeps us from moving forward, then we have to raise questions on that.
So what? How do you get more to policy and forget about politics?
Basically, politicians need to be able to claim credit. And this is because of the electoral incentives that they respond to. If we're going to get governmental units to actually work together, you have to incentivize cooperation. And that's really kind of tough to do if you're playing the field as if it's a zero-sum game. There is one business that we're competing against each other for. Somebody's got to win it. Then bring out the knives and let's go at it. Well, actually, you could cooperate, not actually put together as necessarily a set of giveaways in order to lure that business into the region, because the spillover effect from the presence of that company is going to, the workers aren't all going to live right there by the firm. They're going to be spread out. The supply chain is going to be spread out if it's a manufacturing entity. So the incentives don't necessarily have to be coming from one single jurisdiction. It could be through multiple jurisdictions working together and cooperating. But as long as electoral pressures are what they are, they have to be able to claim jobs. And so we lose Continental, that's a bad day for the politicians. When we win Continental, that's a good day for the politicians in that jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to think beyond jurisdictional boundaries. And that's a structural issue.
Sorry, David, I got to cut you off. We have
Yep.
about a minute and a half left. You were in South Carolina state
Right.
government, and now you're on the other side
Right.
of that. What's the hard work we need to do?
Leadership, and the good news is we've got it, and I think North Carolina's got it too. I was there in the Beasley administration and saw a governor sit down and tell the various players in the state, we're going to be Team South Carolina. With Secretary Royal, they made that happen. Governor Haley has done it, and Bobby Hitt is carrying it out. I think with Governor McCrory in North Carolina, advised by somebody we probably all know, Tony Almeida, who's a seasoned economic development pro, you're going to see some good things happen. But it's going to be a chief executive saying, this is my goal, like Governor Haley did with Continental, and she had that team working. and you see the results.
Well, and Sharon Decker is the head of commerce too. I'm really excited because she gets it.
Yeah.
She understands economic development.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Secretary Decker is scheduled to be on this program, and we will ask her about that. We are out of time, and you are so lucky you don't have to answer that Charlotte Airport question.
I appreciate that.
Get everybody out here.
Good to have you all on the program.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Kid. Thanks for being here. Louis,
Thanks.
always nice to have you.
Thank you.
Frank, good to see you. Thank you.
here.
David,
Always.
welcome.
Thank you very
Hope you
much.
come back.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Until next week, I'm Chris William, and we hope all your business is good. Have a good weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.